the late 18th century, the world stood at a turning point. Across the Atlantic Ocean, a group of 13 British colonies would soon challenge the most powerful empire of their age. Their struggle for independence would reshape global politics and give birth to the United States of America. But hidden behind this triumphant story is a lesser-known truth, a truth written in debt, desperation, and royal downfall. The American Revolution did not only change America. It quietly pushed the French monarchy toward financial ruin and helped ignite the flames of revolution in France itself. France entered the American Revolutionary War not out of idealism alone, but out of calculation. For decades, France had been locked in a bitter rivalry with Great Britain. The British victory in the 7 Years' War had humiliated France, stripping it of colonies, prestige, and influence. Supporting the American rebels offered France a chance to weaken its greatest enemy without fighting a direct war on European soil. What seemed like a strategic investment soon became a financial nightmare. By the 1770s, France's economy was already fragile. The royal treasury was drained by previous wars, lavish court spending, and an outdated tax system that placed most of the burden on the poor while protecting the nobility and clergy. King Louis XVI inherited a kingdom drowning in debt, yet still clinging to the illusion of absolute power. When news arrived of colonial rebellion in America, France saw opportunity, but underestimated the cost. At first, French support to the American colonies was secretive. Weapons, gunpowder, uniforms, and supplies were funneled through covert channels. French merchants and agents acted as intermediaries, allowing the crown to deny involvement. Even these early efforts strained the treasury. Every musket shipped across the Atlantic represented money France did not truly have. Yet success in America promised revenge against Britain, and so the spending continued. By 1778, secrecy gave way to open war. France formally allied with the American colonies and declared war on Great Britain. This decision transformed a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. French fleets crossed oceans, French armies marched overseas, and French gold flowed endlessly into the American cause. Maintaining a navy alone consumed enormous resources: ships, sailors, cannon, and constant repairs. Naval warfare against Britain, the world's strongest sea power, was brutally expensive. The French crown borrowed heavily to finance the war. Loans came from domestic lenders, foreign bankers, and even rival nations. Instead of raising taxes, a move that risked unrest, the monarchy chose debt as a temporary solution. But temporary became permanent. Interest piled on interest. By the war's end, France had spent an estimated 1.3 billion livres supporting the American Revolution, an astronomical figure for the time. French soldiers who fought in America returned home with stories of liberty, representation, and written constitutions. They had witnessed a society challenging monarchy itself. Ironically, while the American victory strengthened Republican ideals, it weakened the very monarchy that helped secure that victory. The French people saw the cost but felt none of the reward. By 1783, Britain had lost the war, and America was independent. In Paris, celebrations masked a looming disaster. The French state was effectively bankrupt. Nearly half of all government spending now went towards servicing debt. The crown struggled to pay soldiers, maintain infrastructure, or respond to food shortages. The financial system was cracking under its own weight. Attempts at reform followed, but each failed. Finance ministers proposed taxing the nobility and clergy, long exempt from meaningful contributions. The privileged classes resisted fiercely. Parliaments blocked reforms. The king hesitated, fearful of confrontation. Meanwhile, common people faced rising bread prices, unemployment, and hunger. The American War had not caused these problems alone, but it had accelerated every weakness within the French system. The monarchy's credibility collapsed alongside its finances. People began to question why they should suffer for wars that brought them no benefit. Pamphlets circulated, criticizing royal excess and inequality. Enlightenment ideas, once confined to salons, spread to the streets. The myth of the king as a benevolent ruler began to crumble. Within 6 years of America's independence, France would descend into revolution. The Estates General would be called for the first time in over a century, not because of ideology, but because the state had run out of money. The path from Yorktown to the Bastille was shorter than it seemed. America's revolution had won freedom across the ocean, but in doing so, it had quietly bankrupted the French king and destabilized an entire kingdom. This is not a story of simple cause and effect, but of unintended consequences. France helped create a new nation, yet paid for it with its own collapse. The American Revolution was not just a fight for independence, it was a spark that ignited one of history's most dramatic chain reactions. And the true cost of that victory would soon be paid in blood on the streets of Paris. As the echoes of victory faded in America, France was left to confront a far harsher reality at home. The war that had humbled Britain had not healed France's wounds, it had deepened them. By the mid-1780s, the French state existed in a condition of permanent crisis. The kingdom was not merely short on money, it was structurally incapable of fixing itself. The American Revolution had exposed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored, and the consequences were now unavoidable. France's financial system was deeply flawed long before the war began. Taxation was unequal and inefficient. The nobility and clergy, who owned vast lands and enjoyed enormous wealth, paid little to nothing in taxes. Instead, the burden fell on peasants, urban workers, and the growing middle class. These groups paid taxes on land, income, goods, and even basic necessities like salt and bread. War spending only magnified this injustice, pushing ordinary people closer to desperation. To keep the state functioning, the monarchy relied heavily on borrowing. French finance ministers understood that debt was becoming dangerous, but political reality limited their options. Any attempt to tax the privileged classes triggered fierce resistance. Parliaments, regional courts dominated by nobles, blocked reforms and portrayed themselves as defenders of tradition. In truth, they were protecting their own wealth while the nation bled financially. Jacques Necker, one of the most famous finance ministers of the era, attempted to restore confidence through transparency. He published reports showing the state's finances, a radical move at the time. But these reports masked the true scale of military debt, especially loans taken for the American War. Necker's optimism temporarily calmed markets, but it delayed necessary reforms. France was borrowing time it did not have. By the late 1780s, lenders began to lose faith. Interest rates rose sharply. Credit tightened. The monarchy struggled to secure new loans just to pay interest on old ones. This vicious cycle pushed the state closer to collapse. Nearly half of government revenue was now consumed by debt repayment alone. The war for American independence had ended, but its financial shadow remained everywhere. Meanwhile, nature delivered its own blow. A series of poor harvests struck France in the years leading up to 1789. Grain shortages caused bread prices to soar. For ordinary families, bread made up the majority of daily calories. Even small increases meant hunger. As prices rose, wages stagnated. Hunger turned into anger, and anger turned into political awareness. The contrast between royal excess and public suffering became impossible to ignore. While common people struggled to survive, Versailles remained a symbol of extravagance. Lavish banquets, elaborate clothing, and endless ceremonies continued as if nothing had changed. Though the American War was fought in the name of liberty, its cost was being paid by those who had none. Ideas imported from America further fueled unrest. French officers who had fought alongside the colonists returned inspired by constitutional government and individual rights. They spoke of written laws, elected assemblies, and limits on power. These ideas blended with Enlightenment philosophy already circulating in France. The result was a population increasingly unwilling to accept absolute monarchy as natural or just. King Louis XVI was not blind to the danger, but he was indecisive. He approved reform proposals, then retreated under pressure. Each delay worsened the crisis. When new finance ministers proposed taxing the nobility, the king hesitated. When they suggested cutting court expenses, resistance mounted. Leadership paralysis became a defining feature of the monarchy's final years. By 1788, the situation had become critical. The treasury was empty. The government could no longer meet its obligations. Soldiers went unpaid. Infrastructure decayed. Confidence collapsed. For the first time in over a century, the king was forced to summon the Estates General, an assembly representing the clergy, nobility, and common people. This decision was driven not by democratic ideals, but by bankruptcy. The calling of the Estates General unleashed forces the monarchy could not control. Representatives of the Third Estate, commoners, demanded fair representation and real political power. They argued that those who paid taxes should have a voice in how money was spent. These demands were rooted directly in the financial disaster caused by decades of mismanagement and accelerated by the American War. What had begun as a financial crisis became a political revolution. The state's inability to pay its debts undermined its authority. The king's need for money forced him to negotiate with his people, something absolute monarchy was never designed to do. In this sense, American independence did more than weaken France economically. It shattered the illusion of royal invincibility. The American Revolution did not cause the French Revolution by itself, but it acted as a catalyst. It drained resources, spread revolutionary ideas, and exposed systemic injustice. Without the enormous financial burden of supporting America, the monarchy might have survived longer. But history rarely offers second chances. By the end of the decade, France stood on the brink. Debt, hunger, inequality, and new ideas collided in a perfect storm. The hidden cost of America's freedom was now impossible to conceal. What France had helped create across the Atlantic would soon inspire its own people to rise, not against a distant empire, but against their own king. When the Estates General convened in May 1789, it was meant to solve a financial crisis. Instead, it exposed a political one that could no longer be contained. For the first time in generations, representatives from across France gathered to address the kingdom's collapse. Yet beneath the formal proceedings lay deep resentment, sharpened by years of hunger, inequality, and debt. The American Revolution had emptied the treasury, but it was the people who now demanded accountability. The structure of the Estates General reflected the inequalities of the old regime. Society was divided into three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the Third Estate, everyone else. Though the Third Estate represented nearly 98% of the population, it was traditionally granted the same number of votes as the other two combined. This system ensured that reform could always be blocked by privilege. The financial catastrophe made this imbalance intolerable. Members of the Third Estate arrived with written lists of grievances. These documents spoke of crushing taxes, arbitrary justice, food shortages, and royal extravagance. Again and again, debt appeared at the center of their complaints. Why, they asked, should ordinary people pay for wars and policies decided without their consent? The cost of supporting American independence had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the monarchy. When negotiations stalled, the Third Estate took a revolutionary step. They declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming the authority to represent the nation as a whole. This act was unprecedented. It directly challenged the king's absolute authority and transformed a financial meeting into a political revolt. The monarchy's inability to manage its finances had now undermined its legitimacy. The king attempted to reassert control, but events moved faster than royal command. When troops were positioned around Paris, fear spread that the assembly would be dissolved by force. Tensions exploded in July 1789, as rumors and hunger collided. On July 14, a crowd stormed the Bastille, a symbol of royal power and arbitrary imprisonment. Though it held few prisoners, its fall sent shockwaves across France. The storming of the Bastille marked a point of no return. The authority of the crown collapsed in the eyes of the people. Across the countryside, peasants rose against landlords, burning records of feudal obligations and refusing to pay dues. This wave of unrest, known as the Great Fear, was driven by both desperation and hope. Years of economic suffering, worsened by war debt, had finally erupted into action. Inside the National Assembly, reform accelerated. Feudal privileges were abolished. Noble tax exemptions ended in theory, though not without resistance. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty. These ideas echoed the principles that French soldiers had encountered in America, now reshaped for a European revolution, yet financial crisis remained central. the new revolutionary government inherited a mountain of debt, much of it accumulated during the American War. To address this, church lands were confiscated and sold to back a new paper currency, the assignat. Initially, this solution provided relief. But excessive printing soon caused inflation, further destabilizing the economy and eroding public trust. King Louis XVI found himself trapped between worlds. He accepted some reforms while secretly hoping for a return to absolute power. His indecision proved fatal. When he attempted to flee France in 1791, he was captured and returned to Paris in disgrace. The king who had helped finance liberty abroad was now seen as an enemy of it at home. As revolution radicalized, the link between debt and betrayal became sharper. Many revolutionaries blamed the monarchy's foreign wars, especially its intervention in America, for France's suffering. Pamphlets and speeches portrayed the royal family as reckless gamblers who had sacrificed their people's welfare for glory and revenge against Britain. By 1792, France was at war again, this time against much of Europe. Ironically, the financial collapse caused in part by foreign intervention now fueled further conflict. Revolutionary leaders believed war would spread their ideals and unite the nation. Instead, it deepened chaos. Inflation soared, shortages worsened, and political violence intensified. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed. His death symbolized the final cost of the American Revolution for France. The monarchy that had funded liberty across the Atlantic paid for it with its own destruction. The guillotine did not fall because of America alone, but the debt incurred in that distant war had helped set every stage in motion. The French Revolution would go on to reshape Europe, inspiring uprisings and provoking empires. Yet at its core remained a simple truth: a state that cannot manage its finances cannot survive. France's support of American independence was a gamble that weakened a rival but destroyed itself in the process. The American Revolution is often remembered as a clean victory, a story of freedom won against overwhelming odds. But history is rarely so simple. Behind every triumph lies a cost paid by someone else. For France, that cost was bankruptcy, revolution, and the end of a 1,000-year monarchy. The road from Lexington to the guillotine was paved not with ideals alone, but with unpaid debts, broken systems, and unintended consequences that changed the world forever. When the dust settled after the French Revolution, Europe was left transformed. Monarchies trembled, empires recalculated, and the old political order faced a future it could no longer control. Yet beneath the sweeping changes lay a quieter lesson, one written not in speeches or declarations, but in ledgers and unpaid loans. The downfall of the French monarchy was not only the result of ideology or rebellion. It was the consequence of a financial gamble that began across the Atlantic. France's intervention in the American Revolution was meant to restore prestige and weaken Britain. In military terms, it succeeded. Britain lost its colonies, and France regained a sense of honor after decades of humiliation. But victory came without profit. Unlike Britain, France gained no new territory, no trade monopoly, and no long-term economic advantage. What it gained instead was debt, vast, unmanageable debt. The French monarchy believed it could win glory first and manage the consequences later. This approach reflected a deeper flaw in the old regime, a political system disconnected from economic reality. Decisions were made by courtiers and kings insulated from the suffering of the population. War was treated as an instrument of prestige, not as a financial burden borne by millions. America's independence exposed the cost of that illusion. After the execution of Louis XVI, revolutionary governments struggled with the same financial problems. Debt did not disappear with the monarchy. It followed France into the Republic, fueling instability and violence. Radical measures were justified in the name of survival. The Reign of Terror was driven not only by ideology, but by economic desperation, inflation, shortages, and the fear of collapse. Eventually, power consolidated under Napoleon Bonaparte. His rise marked the end of the revolutionary chaos and the beginning of a new authoritarian order. Napoleon understood what the monarchy had failed to grasp: war required structure, taxation, and administration. Yet even his empire would ultimately fall to the same forces: overextension, debt, and endless conflict. The lesson of America's Revolution echoed again. Across the Atlantic, the United States emerged as a symbol of success. Its independence became a model for future revolutions, from Latin America to Europe. Yet America's victory was built on foreign support, particularly French money and military power. Without French loans, fleets, and soldiers, independence might have failed. The irony is unmistakable. The nation born in the name of liberty was financed by a collapsing monarchy. Historians continue to debate how decisive the American War was in France's downfall. France faced deep structural problems long before 1776. But the American Revolution acted as an accelerant. It intensified debt, delayed reform, and spread revolutionary ideas. Most importantly, it forced the monarchy to confront its financial weakness and fail publicly. The story challenges simple narratives of heroism and progress. Revolutions do not occur in isolation. They ripple outward, affecting allies and enemies alike. America's freedom did not come without cost, it merely shifted that cost elsewhere. In this case, it was paid by French peasants, workers, and ultimately, a king. Modern states still face similar choices. Wars are often justified as investments in security or influence, but their true cost emerges decades later. Debt, inflation, and political instability follow predictable patterns. The fall of the French monarchy serves as a warning across centuries. No power, however grand, can escape economic reality. Today, the Bastille is gone, Versailles is a museum, and America is a global power. Yet the connection between them remains written into history. One revolution helped destroy an empire while creating another nation. The consequences were neither planned nor controlled, but they reshaped the modern world. The American Revolution bankrupted the French king not because France supported liberty, but because it did so without reforming itself. The tragedy lies not in helping America, but in refusing to change at home. The monarchy clung to privilege while financing revolution abroad, and paid the ultimate price. History often remembers victories, not invoices. But behind every revolution lies a balance sheet, and behind every collapse, a series of choices ignored too long. The hidden cost of America's independence was not paid in dollars or pounds, but in livres, and in lives. This is the final irony of the age of revolutions. Freedom crossed oceans, but debt followed close behind. And when it arrived in France, it brought with it the end of a king, the fall of a system, and the birth of the modern world.